Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today I'm joined with Sharon Klein. How are you doing today, Sharon?
I'm great. How are you?
Good, good. Well, glad to have you join us. Brought Sharon on. We want to talk about an interesting topic we're getting a lot of questions from listeners about, so wanted to kind of tie this in. But Sharon, why don't you tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. I'm president of Family Wealth in the Eastern US region for Wilmington Trust, and I oversee the delivery of the full spectrum of wealth management services that we deliver by our teams of professionals. So that is everything from investment management, acting as trustee, estate and tax planning, financial planning, financing, insurance, banking services, the whole panoply of services there. And I also lead our national divorce advisory practice, which has a broad array of offerings that are specifically designed for people who are maneuvering through divorce or recently divorced. In terms of my background, I'm actually a trust and estates attorney by training. I spent the first 11 years of my career at a big New York City law firm before moving to the corporate side of the fence. And before Wilmington, I was at heading up the wealth advisory platform at Lazard, the storied investment bank, and their wealth management platform. And I've been at Wilmington 10 years now.
Nice. So what kind of drew you into getting into kind of the divorce area? I mean, that seems like a very specialized area.
It is a specialized area, and actually, that's a great question. It was a niche that I felt really needed to be filled. I mean, we're in the business of helping people. That's what we do, really, as planners, as financial advisors. What we want to do is help people. And a lot of people, when they're maneuvering through divorce, they're feeling very scared. They're feeling very, very vulnerable, and they don't really know how to proceed and how to gain the confidence to start a new chapter in their lives. And so we felt that there was a need to fill this space with services that we provide that individuals often use, but they have a different tilt when you're getting a divorce. And we wanted to provide those services specifically for this audience.
So what's different about those kind of services? I would imagine that, when it comes to wealth management, most things are the same, just the details are different. So what is different, or obviously divorce is different than non-divorce, but what is different? Can you give us some of those examples of
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes in a marriage, people take on different roles and responsibilities, and oftentimes it's one partner who leads a various aspect of the marriage. And so typically you see one person sort of in charge of the finances, and the other person taking a less involved role, may not even know what's involved in running the household or what the assets are, what the expenses are. And so that person feels particularly vulnerable when they lose the leader of that sort of partnership in that area of their lives. And so they really need a lot of help. They need a lot of help in the financial aspect. They need a lot of help with planning, or planning typically needs to be redone and updated. Children are involved. It's a very complicated area. And because people feel particularly vulnerable, it's an area where you really have to give advice against the backdrop of what people are going through and be very empathetic and sympathetic in the delivery of the advice.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I would think that if you're let's say your partner's doing most of the financial stuff, and then 20 years later you have to take on that burden, you haven't done much for 20 years, so you're kind of out of your element, right?
That's exactly correct. And oftentimes, when we begin to help people in this situation, they don't think they could do it. They don't think that they're capable of taking charge of their financial lives, of living independently. And one actually, Kirk, of the most rewarding elements of this practice is to instill in people that confidence that they can do it. They can take charge of their financial lives, which involves educating them and making them, running financial projections, giving them data, giving them the information on which to base decisions. And it's rewarding to see them emerge as very self-confident, self-assured people. And oftentimes people tell me that divorce was a horrendous experience that they really wouldn't wish on their worst enemy. However, they've emerged as a person they didn't think that they were. And that's really the positive aspect of it. You create these independent, self-assured people. So you're exactly correct with that. They start off in a very different place.
But I would imagine if somebody's going through this and they haven't done it for a long period of time, and you're just kind of dumping information on them, which is basically what it equates to, right? They have no responsibility, and now all of a sudden they've got all of it. There's a huge amount of overwhelm there. So how do
Yes.
you help them with that?
Well, that's a great question. And the first step really is to get organized, because particularly if you haven't been involved in the finances, a person like that may not even have a clear picture of the marital balance sheet, right? They may not understand their cash flow needs. They may need to educate themselves about what actually are the assets of the marriage and what do they actually need in terms of cash flow to sustain a lifestyle. So the first thing they typically need to do is assemble financial documents, review financial documents, which could include bank statements, investment accounts, retirement accounts, tax returns, oftentimes with a financial advisor, particularly if they don't have the wherewithal or the experience to analyze those statements and assets themselves, because they need to get an understanding of their current income, their expenses, their assets, their debts. So it usually starts with an education about getting organized. That's how it begins.
Okay. And then what would be the steps after that? Because getting organized certainly is going to be an enormous part, and that may solve a lot
Yeah.
of problems in itself. But then what should people think about?
Well, there are little things to think about, and then there are bigger things to think about, right? So the little things to think about are things like, does someone have an account in their own name? So they have cash available. Do they have a credit history? They should ask for a credit report, because in some marriages, even very wealthy marriages, some clients, some spouses have been an additional card holder on the main spouse's credit card accounts, and they may not have their own credit history. So they should apply for a credit card if they haven't had one before. I actually have a client recently I was working with, very, very wealthy couple, but she never had a credit card. She's been married over 20 years, never had a credit card in her own name because she was an additional card holder on her husband's account. And when she applied for a credit card, she had no credit history. And the most she could get, the credit limit was $300. And when you have two kids to feed, $300 does really not go a long way. But she got the credit card and she built up her credit history. So things like that, it's really important to point out to people. But the most important thing, and this is really the ultimate goal of sort of getting organized and getting the right advice and having the right professional team in place, is that you need to establish from the get-go a very thoughtful long-term plan, particularly if you're going to receive a lump sum settlement or alimony proceeds that are designed to last for an indefinite period of time. You want to make sure that you're going to sustain your lifestyle. So you need to consult with a financial advisor to do things like running cash flow projections, which includes cost of living adjustments, cash flow analysis to help you budget, to plan. The bottom line, Kirk, is that you want to instill confidence in a person that they're going to have financial stability. So when you're running these types of projections, it's very important, for example, to stress test a proposed settlement sum for different investment landscapes, different economic climates, projecting different rates of return, building in inflation assumptions, tax consequences, and doing it in a way that's comprehensive, doing it in a way that's not simplistic. So a simplistic sort of Excel type based calculation to show how well a settlement sum is going to last a lifetime can give a false sense of security, because simplistic assumptions tend to be static, right? You build in a rate of return every year, you build in spending every year, but life is not linear and static, and markets are not linear and static. And so when you get, might have those projections, and then you get a pandemic or a Russian invasion, right? And who knows what markets could do. So sophisticated analytics, way beyond an Excel spreadsheet, can really help actually both position a matrimonial attorney at the negotiating table to demonstrate why, for example, more funds might be needed, as well as help sort of plan out a life after divorce. And I can give you an example of this. Actually, we have proprietary analytics that we run for clients in these types of scenarios. And we had an attorney come the other day with a client who he had just negotiated a divorce settlement for. And she was in her early 60s, and he negotiated a $10 million settlement, which seems like a very nice settlement sum. But the husband was extremely wealthy, and this was actually a pretty modest sum considering the wealth. And the attorney for his negotiating had run an Excel spreadsheet to show that this woman who was in her early 60s, if she was going to get $10 million at age 90, his Excel spreadsheet showed that she was going to have more money than she did in her current age in her early 60s, because the growth of the assets was going to exceed her spending. Unfortunately, when we modeled out the same assumptions, and we stress tested the portfolio with different economic climates, different market conditions, we showed that not only was she not going to have more money at age 90, but she was going to run out of money before that age. And the attorney actually said that he was very sorry he didn't have that data before he started negotiating, because he probably could have negotiated a bigger settlement. That having been said, with these types of analytics, we were able to assure her that if she tempered her lifestyle expectations a little, she could still live a very comfortable life. So very, very important to have those types of analytics to give people peace of mind about the future.
Well, it sounds like there were a bunch of errors made on that. First of all, somebody's going to run out of money with $10 million. That's a problem in of itself. But the attorney not seeing the misbalancing of the split also seems like an error. It seems like a lot of errors made on that part. Does that happen frequently?
Well, it's about having the right data, right? It's all about the data. It's having the right data. And, if you're too simplistic in your assumptions, you may not get a realistic output of life, which, as I said, life is not linear and life is not static. So it's all about having the right team and the right information and the right tools to give you the data.
Right. Well, so it sounds like, beyond that, I mean, it sounds like some of these people who are kind of going through this definitely need some financial coaching. If you're going to run out of money with $10 million, not judging, I mean, it is what it is, but that to me, for most people, that seems like if you can't get by on $10 million, then there's something wrong with the equation. And like I said, not saying she doesn't deserve it or anything like that. It's just that's a lot of money, and most people will never have that. And if you run out, then it means you're probably spending too much.
Well, it all depends on your standard of living, right? And this was an exceptionally wealthy couple who had multiple homes, and they flew privately. So, as you say, we don't want to judge. We just want to ensure that if someone has an expectation about a certain lifestyle, that's realistic. Otherwise, they have to temper their expectations. So this was actually not a huge amount of money in the sort of the scheme of what was on this particular marital balance sheet. But it was just an example, Kirk. I mean, you could say it was a $1 million settlement, and it's the same philosophy. It's the same type of considerations that you take into account. Is someone going to lead the life that they want to lead with the money that they have available to them, knowing that life might be unpredictable? So that really is the bottom line.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Maybe I wasn't clear with my questioning. Where I was going with it was basically that, I know in my state, in sort of divorces, the men pretty much every single time will get the short end of the stick. It's how the state is structured. The divorce settlement is structured for the most part. It benefits the women in virtually every single time, unless they can kind of come to terms with something equal. Some states it might be the opposite, right? It's just every state's different with how they're structured. My question is really, you alluded to the fact that it was misbalanced, and I think the question I'm asking is that, if it's a 50-50 split, it's a 50-50 split, right? It is what it is, right? But when you have a misbalancing, as you said, there's expectations and things people are accustomed to, more likely than not, that being accustomed to a certain kind of living and a misbalancing seems like there's something broken in the process. So do you find when people go through this process that they need to be especially aware of the negotiation part, or how should people think about that part of it? Because it seems like that's the first piece you need to solve. The rest is, secondary to that.
Yeah, well, I don't know what you mean by the men always get the short end
In
of the
Massachusetts,
stick. Okay.
there's a
All right.
preferential
Well,
treatment towards women in Massachusetts, is what I'm saying. It just
oh
means
well,
that it's not a 50-50 kind of sort of thing, is what I'm saying.
okay. Well, I don't know about that, but in any event, certainly, the laws vary from state to state. And I think that, you kind of start with someone's accustomed standard of living and what's on the marital balance sheet, and you go from there. And so for different household expectations and different household incomes and assets, you have different outcomes. But courts will certainly look at the lifestyle a couple has lived, and who's contributed to that, either in a monetary sense or in raising the family and taking care of the household. But I think the bottom line is that it's a very specific individual analysis for each couple as to what would be appropriate in terms of a split.
Okay, so getting more to my question. So should people be relying on their attorney for that sort of guidance, or are there specialized things that they can do elsewise to look at that as a consideration?
Well, it's important to have attorneys in the picture, both matrimonial attorneys to represent you in the divorce trust and estates attorneys to update all of your planning, which I hope we get to because that's an important area. But in terms of these financial analytics, you really need a financial advisor. I mean, the attorneys are helping more on the legal side to negotiate the divorce, to help update documents after the divorce is final. But in terms of running these types of projections and having the financial data with which to approach the negotiating table, financial advisors, sophisticated financial advisors, are really best equipped to help someone because they have these types of sophisticated analytics that we're really designed and built to provide that information for clients. So a financial advisor is certainly the best bet on that count.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this, as you kind of alluded to this, and make sure we get to it with enough time, is when people go through divorce, it changes the situation quite a bit. And typically I find that there's always things that are missed, or, the ex-spouse is still a beneficiary in the insurance policy and things like that. So what are some things that people should consider when it comes to estate planning or otherwise after they go through divorce?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for raising that because that's a very, very important topic. And during times of any transition, particularly divorce, it's really key to review all of your estate planning documents, your beneficiary designations, to ensure that they reflect your current wishes. And when you're talking about updating documents, the first document that comes to mind is a will, right? To look at the will to see how property passes, is that still appropriate? To look at your executor and trustee choices, are they the right people that you have in those roles? And while some planning, if you're maneuvering through divorce, might have to wait until the divorce decree is final, wills in most jurisdictions generally can and should be updated, even while the divorce is pending. Because even while the divorce is pending, you want to leave to a soon to be ex-spouse the minimum required under your state's laws, or a prior agreement like a prenuptial, because under the laws of virtually every state, people are required to leave their spouse a certain percentage of their estate. Depending on the state and whether or not someone has children, that's typically between a half and a third of the estate, but you don't have to leave more than that, right? So while divorce is pending, you could update your documents to leave the minimum amount required. And then after you're divorced, you could eliminate the ex-spouse entirely. As I mentioned, who's your executor? Who's trustee of trust that you create? They're very important fiduciary roles. And typically people don't want to see an ex-spouse continue in those roles. So very important to update that. There are other documents that are part of the sort of the planning panoply of documents, very important to update. They include a power of attorney, which allows one person to make financial decisions on behalf of another. A healthcare proxy, which allows one person to make medical decisions for another if they're unable to do so. A living will, which basically basically evidences an intent that you don't want to be kept alive in a vegetative state. So is an ex-spouse or a soon-to-be ex-spouse, is that the person you want to make important healthcare or financial decisions for you? Probably not. And those documents can also typically be updated while the divorce is pending. I have, a celebrity example of this kind of gone awry, and you may know Gary Coleman, who was an actor in a famous sitcom, Different Strokes. He finalized his divorce with his ex-spouse, Shannon Price, in 2008. And then in 2010, he sustained a head injury and he was put on life support, and he hadn't updated his healthcare proxy. And so his ex-wife made critical end-of-life decisions for him. Is that what he would have wanted had you asked him? Maybe not, but that's what happened. So really important to update those documents. There are other documents that need to be updated that deal with assets that pass outside of a will. So for example, and this one oftentimes gets missed because people think I've done my will, it's all taken care of, but assets need to be titled consistently with your new plan. So for example, if you have an account that has a designation of where it's going to pass on death, or if you have jointly owned property that passes outside the will. If you have assets that have a beneficiary designation, like a retirement asset or life insurance, those assets pass outside the will. So it's really important to make sure that beneficiary designations dovetail with the new plan. Life insurance is a very important consideration in the divorce arena in general, because you want to prevent an ex-spouse's death from creating a catastrophic void where there should be alimony, child support, educational costs paid, or other obligations. So it's often very prudent to consider life insurance as part of the divorce settlement. And it's key, of course, to make sure that the spouse who's maintaining the insurance pays the premiums so that the policy doesn't lapse. So one practical idea I always suggest to confirm that the policy is properly being maintained is to ensure that the spouse who's going to receive the proceeds in the event of an untimely death actually receives duplicate premium notices or confirmations of payment to be sure that the premium payments are being made. And when you're structuring life insurance, it's very important to look at how the life insurance is held, because if the insured person owns the life insurance, the proceeds will generally be taxable in their estate. And we have now top 40% federal estate tax brackets. So that means if you have $1 million policy, you could potentially lose $400,000 to taxes. That's federal taxes. There may be state taxes on top of that. So a more efficient way to hold life insurance is typically to hold it in a properly structured irrevocable life insurance trust or an ILIT. And if you do that, the policy proceeds can pass tax-free to your heirs. So a much more efficient way to hold on to the proceeds than to give up a huge portion of it to taxes. On the planning front as well, I would say that it's important, if you have signed a prenuptial agreement, to carefully review that agreement and see what rights or obligations you might have to be sure that they're incorporated in the planning on the back end. So that's what I would say in terms of planning. Very, very important.
Okay. No, that's great. I appreciate you sharing. So it brings up a few questions. You just mentioned that there'd be a life insurance policy that's maintained after the divorce. And I would imagine sometimes people maybe aren't the best of friends after. So what keeps them from changing the beneficiaries to whoever they want in the process? And because if they die, you can't do anything to them. So what's the repercussions of them just saying, well, we're just going to change the beneficiaries because I feel like it?
Well, usually you would have that built into a settlement agreement or a divorce decree. So it would, if someone changed it, that would be a breach of that, and the person who was owed the insurance would be entitled to sue that person or entitled to sue their estate. But to your point, getting duplicate premium notices or confirmations of payment, making sure that someone is in the loop about the maintenance of the insurance policy is key, because yes, you may have a claim against an estate in the event the insurance wasn't maintained properly, but much easier to make sure that it's being maintained during the course of someone's life than to come in at the end and have a claim against someone's estate.
Yeah, I totally agree. Okay, so I know we've talked about a lot of the organizational part. What are some of the biggest mistakes people make here that people should be aware of that maybe they can just be aware of, so they don't kind of fall down these into these landmines?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest mistakes I see is people not having a prenuptial agreement. I think a prenuptial agreement is so important. Um, Prenuptial agreements sometimes have negative connotations, right? It's sort of meant to be, oh, you don't really think this marriage is going to succeed. That's why you're asking me for a prenup. But I really think that we need to change that negative perception around prenups and to really think of prenups as the perfect setting for engaged couples to be transparent and honest with each other about their finances, about their spending habits, and actually, what's more romantic than entering a marriage with mutual understanding about a couple's financial future. And, particularly if you have substantial assets that you bring into the marriage or a difference in the wealth between the spouses, it could help allay some of that financial uncertainty that's associated with building a household together. So the wealthier spouse, for example, may feel confident that their assets are safe. The less wealthy spouse may feel relieved to know that they'll be getting some property or alimony, even if the marriage doesn't succeed in the long term. And very important to have a prenup, the planning on the prenup dovetail with the estate planning. I don't know, Kirk, if you're familiar with the HBO series White Lotus. Um, it's a social satire. It involves the exploits of guests at a chain of fictional luxurious hotel resorts, and one of the subplots involves a character called Tanya. She's a fabulously wealthy widow who marries a man of very modest means. She later suspects to be a gold digger who's trying to have her killed. And at one point in the series, she has a revelation, and she says, "Oh my God, the prenup." And Tanya's revelation is that if they got divorced, her husband would get nothing because that's what the prenuptial agreement provided. And yet, if she died, he would inherit everything. And so her revelation is really an important reminder that every marriage, every single one, without exception, is going to end in one of two ways, right? Either death or divorce. And attorneys should cover both outcomes in prenuptial agreements so death doesn't become an unexpected windfall to the surviving spouse.
To
So,
me, that
yes.
seems like the prenup is one of those, like you said, maybe it needs to be more normalized, but to me it seems like every when I was going through this when I was younger, and all my friends are getting married, and some of them had wealth, some didn't, and you had this this conversation that was happening, and every single time it was just it just threw a lot of cold water on the relationship, because it was just, and usually it was because of the parents would require, because the parents are the ones that had the money,
Mm-hmm.
and the concern from the parents was, what if they get divorced, and so then the child is left with having this conversation with their new spouse or new fiance, and they've got to convince their new fiance that it's not them, it's the parents, and then so it just kind of gets into this really deep conversation that it just complicates everything, and really changes the relationship in many ways.
Well, I think it's all in the way you approach it, Kirk. I mean, if you approach it in a way that you want to start the marriage with a shared understanding and open communication. Sometimes parents are used as the bad guys, right? I wouldn't do this, but my parents kind of forcing me to do it. Then sometimes that takes some of the edge off of it. But I think also that it's kind of like, if you don't have a will, if some people say, I don't have a will. If you didn't write your will yourself, you still have a will. What's your will? Your state is going to step in and your state is going to say what happens to your assets. So you have a will. And it's kind of the same thing in the marriage context, right? Different states have different laws regarding the divisions of assets in divorce. And if you don't have a prenup, your state is going to step in and your state is going to have laws about what happens in the event of a divorce. And sometimes it's subjective and sometimes you may not like it. So isn't it better to proactively plan and put in place, whether you're talking about a will, whether you're talking about a prenuptial agreement, something that you specifically want, instead of the laws that are thrust upon you by the state if you do nothing? So that's my view of it.
Well, I think that's a very practical, pragmatic approach, Sharon. And I don't know too many 25-year-olds getting married that are practical or pragmatic.
Well,
maybe that's
true.
the problem, but
That's true. That's true. I mean, for young people, it may not seem practical. Certainly, if young people come from wealthy families or if there are trust assets in the families, it's certainly prudent to have a prenuptial agreement in place. Much better now when people are young and in love and more apt to agree on things than later down the line when it becomes very, very acrimonious. And a lot is spent, in legal fees and a lot of time and a lot of effort in dragging, very nasty details through the courts. And I think you can prevent a lot of that with a properly drafted prenuptial agreement and open communication before the marriage begins.
yeah, I totally agree. So Sharon, we got to wrap it up here, but what are some final thoughts you can leave us with?
Well, really, it's all about the planning and it's all about the team that you have in place. So divorce is a very emotional time for people, and family members, friends, the support can often be invaluable. But despite their being very well intentioned, family members and friends are often not equipped to deal with the very complex tax, legal, and investment decisions that confront someone going through this process, and they may unintentionally lead you astray. So I think the best advice to give someone is it's really all about the team of advisors that you surround yourselves with. Um, a trusted team of experts, which would typically include a matrimonial attorney, a trust and estates attorney, a financial advisor, an accountant. They could really work together to make the process less daunting for clients, and including that cross-disciplinary viewpoint from, across all these different professionals from the outset, I should add, can really help position clients for success.
Okay, great. Well, Sharon, where can people find more about you?
They could find more about me at Wilmington Trust. So we have actually a landing page that's specifically designed for people who are maneuvering through divorce or contemplating divorce, and that is www.wilmingtontrust.com/divorce. And so I look forward, if anybody has any questions, to them being in touch.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for coming to the show and sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status. for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room. All right, that was a great interview with Sharon. Really interesting topic. I know this is a topic nobody likes to talk about. It's kind of like death, taxes, and divorce, like things we want to talk about. But, you know, at the end of the day, it does affect half of the country. So it's an important topic to talk about nonetheless. So now we're into the panel portion of the show where you have our own Megan Gorman. Hey, Megan.
Hey, Kirk. How you doing today?
Doing great. Doing wonderful. And we have our very own Phil Weiss. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Kirk. How are you today?
Good, good. Glad to have you both here to talk about this wonderful, cheery topic. Well, let's just dive right in. So, Megan, I know you probably come across this a lot, but you know, maybe you could kind of give us a high level, like what's the life cycle of divorce and how should people plan for it and think about the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing people should always keep in mind is if you want to maintain your wealth, it's best not to get divorced. So I would tell anyone, you know, getting married, that really setting up regular meetings to talk about money is a great thing in the beginning of a marriage, because habits get calcified in a marriage. And, you know, a lot of marriage is about routine. And so where I've seen the best marriages are where there is much more partnering on the money. But that being said, you know, unfortunately, not all marriages work out, right? And so what I would say out there is if you are contemplating a separation or divorce, you really need to make sure you understand your, not just your asset base, but how things are titled, right? And also your income. And that's going to be incredibly important, because in understanding your entire financial picture, you are going to have to make strategic decisions. And what I always tell clients when they're thinking about getting divorced and they're thinking about, well, how will we divvy up all the assets, is you really need to take all your assets and put them on a piece of paper and figure out, of the assets, what's your non-negotiable, right? Is there something you are completely unwilling to give up? And what are the other things that are going to be chips in a negotiation? Because all of this ends up being a dance. And I think that a lot of times in a marriage, one spouse might make more than the other. And when I deal with clients, particularly in the high net worth, ultra high net worth space, I always give them the same piece of advice to the person who has more of the income coming in, which is be generous, because if you have children, you will see these people every day until you die. And so while you may not legally be required to do certain things, sometimes using money as a way to smooth out relationships so that the family unit can continue to function post-divorce is incredibly important. So those are some of the basic rules that I see there. So I'll let Phil jump in before I keep going. So I'd love to hear his point of view on this.
Yeah, go ahead, Phil.
The only thing I'd add, I mean, everything, I agree with all that Megan said. The only thing that I add is you only mentioned income. You also want to understand what the expenses are, because you want to get a complete picture of the cash flow. You want to make sure that you know what's coming in and what's going out. And also, as Megan said, it's important that you have a good relationship and you know what's going on. You don't want to just be blindsided, and there's a lot of things that you don't know about that you missed, and you're really scrambling and you're worried that things are going to happen. I mean, I know I went into the bank to make a deposit, and my wife had gone to make a deposit for my kids and they wouldn't let her, and didn't understand why. So I was in the bank with my daughter and I asked, and they said, well, what happened was it was a divorce and a husband had gone into the bank and he was trying to find out if there were any hidden accounts. So he said he forgot the account number and he wanted to make a deposit because they tell him what the balance, or withdrawal? Could they tell him what the balance is? They did. And now he found out about this account that he didn't know existed. And so now that's why my wife couldn't go make that deposit into my kids' accounts, because only my name was on the kids' accounts with the kids. My wife wasn't. And the banks changed the rules because this woman got very upset. Realistically, the husband was right, because this was an asset that was part of, that should have been divided in divorce. But he only found out because the bank gave him the information. She wasn't happy about that. So the bank changed. So you just want to make sure that you're aware, and you, when you're going through the process, look to see if there's anything that you didn't know about.
Yeah, I think that's so crazy important. You know, and the other thing I think to really think about is, I often encourage people to go talk to an attorney privately before things get rolling, to understand the process. One of the biggest issues, you know, when there are assets that I run into, is this concept of a separation date, right? And that there is a formal separation date that sort of partitions what may be marital assets versus separate property assets. And, you know, I think it's really important to understand why that date is so important in terms of managing the entire asset base. You know, a date can mean the difference for certain people of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, depending on when that date is chosen and memorialized. So document, and seek legal advice. Even if you haven't, you know, you can seek legal advice for consultative information before you even start going down a more aggressive path. And I hate when clients do the aggressive path thing, to be candid. I think that getting on my soapbox here, I think the divorce industry is set up that's contrary to people trying to divorce best interests, right? Because it's better for attorneys in general to make sure that this lasts for a bit when it's a big money divorce, where, you know, trying to find something collaborative and being open to really compromise can be the best thing. Because, you know, in divorce, you don't want the biggest bill to be paying attorneys and forensic accountants and all that crazy nonsense.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you mentioned that, Megan. I mean, collaborative divorce is becoming a thing now, which thankfully it is just working together to resolve this. And, you know, it's funny. I remember when I started in the industry, one of my clients was getting divorced, and I was talking with him, and I was just trying to help him through the process. And he's like, yeah, my wife and I put together everything. We said, here's what we want to do. We went to the court, and the court said, no, get an attorney and come back. And it's like, what do you mean? We just gave you what we wanted. We agree on it. Why do we need an attorney? And they're like, no, get an attorney. It's like they're forcing him to go through the legal system, use attorneys and pay attorneys for something that they were able to do themselves. And, you know, you're right. The challenge is you got to pay all this money for an attorney, and the attorneys aren't exactly trying to help them get along, right? Because it's not in their best interest. And, you know, to me, I just see some things. It's like people want to figure it out, right? Like, and I think, like what you're saying, it's really important that people are able to figure it out together. If they can't, which definitely seen some of those where people are at each other and they're doing dirty tricks like emptying joint bank accounts and taking it out and you know, hiding it because they can. It's joint bank account. And there's some crazy shenanigans that go on, but as you kind of both have said, like, you're gonna have to see these people if you have kids. So it's best to just kind of play along and be nice, and just, you know, you may not agree on things, which obviously you're not because you're getting divorced, but you know, you try to get through this the best you can and just move on. And the psychology that comes into it is the biggest part. Is people are hurt, you know, they're in pain and they're angry and they're taking it out on the other person. So let's talk a little bit about the psychological issues that come in too, Phil. You know, because the psychological issues are a big part of this, because it's not just, hey, let's just divide things up in a reasonable fashion. People are doing it while they're emotionally hurt and damaged, and they can't make rational decisions because they want to take it out on the other person, right? It's normal. But what do you see when people go through this, like, psychologically? Like, what's the best way for people to handle this in the most rational way they possibly can?
I think it's important that they take a step back and think about the long-term implications, because you don't want to put a rift. I mean, especially when you got kids, right? You don't want to create a rift. And like, I have a client right now and they're going through a divorce, and the kids are talking to her, but they don't want to talk to him. Now, there's a reason for that, but you want to make sure, like, she's trying to smooth it over, because at the end of the day, they're still both the parents. So you want to make sure that don't tell too much, right? Because that's really what caused this, is she told them a little bit too much. And that turned them against him. And so now it's going to take time. And think about it. If you were involved in that, the last thing you want is not to be able to talk to your kids. So that's really important. Like, consider those things. And when I work with people, the other thing, coming out of it, think about what you want. Right. And so, like, I do life planning with people. So when I'm working with a woman right now that's finishing up her divorce, and so working on her life plan to figure out what it is that she wants to do going forward. Right. Those things are important too. So you just want to make sure you consider all those things. And as the advisor, listen. Like, that's a really important thing that we can do, is we can just listen and let them talk.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, you raise a good point about what they say. I mean, I have a client going through this right now where, the husband and wife are not on good terms. And since I work with him, I don't have her opinion. I don't have her side. So obviously there's always two sides, but in this case, the wife is, let's say, poisoning the well against him. And it's sad. And she actually had some issues, which is the reason they're getting divorced, some alcohol and drug issues. So, there's a reason for it. But the point is it's like, that's the worst thing you do. You're taking it out on the other person by damaging the kid's life. I mean, I can't think of anything worse than, like, basically ruining your kid's life to get back at the other person. Like, it's so sad, but it happens. And some of it's accidental, right? And it happens frequently where the kids don't take kindly to it. No one wants to see their parents get divorced, right? So let's talk about some of the other issues. Well, let's talk about this first, Megan. So, mostly when people get divorced, they go talk to an attorney. But what other professionals can be helpful to include in the process to help both parties through the divorce in the most reasonable manner?
Yeah, let's start with your tax professional, right? One of the biggest things that I see not always thought out the best way in divorce agreements is, on a tax return, who's claiming the children? If you pass the children back and forth, how will that play out year after year in terms of claiming anything from child tax credit to education credits, right? I've done situations a couple years ago under the Biden child tax credits. We actually made a side agreement with a spouse, an ex-spouse, because it would benefit them more if she claimed all the children, but then gave him a credit behind the scenes on other things. So I think the thing is, you want your tax person involved to run out not just the immediate scenario, but a number of different scenarios, because kids now stay on their parents' tax returns till they graduate college, right? So you want to make sure you're thinking through all of those different pieces. Other people you can involve, obviously your financial planner, in dividing up assets. And the financial planner is going to be key, because most people have to remember, when you are having an asset base, your estate plan controls anything that's taxable in nature, but anything that's beneficiary designated in nature, you will need to file new beneficiary designations. There's a ton of case law on horrifying stories where someone forgot to change out their ex-spouse on a pension benefit or an IRA benefit, and tough beneficiary designations stand up. The courts will typically enforce them. So these are really, really important things to focus on. And then I would also tell you, your estate planning attorney, once a divorce is filed, there's certain rules in regards to estate documents that have to occur. But once your divorce is finalized, you do need a new estate plan. It's interesting, because you almost have to rethink a number of things that, how you would handle. So for instance, I have seen people who've gotten divorced where there's potentially a special needs child, and or there's a special needs child, and they've rethought other estate planning techniques, because while they are sure that their ex-spouse might also be doing something for that child in their estate plan, they want to make sure that on their own, they're leaving enough money to care for a special needs child. And so we've done different techniques there, from like ILITs to intentionally defective grantor trusts, that we might not have done when they were married, or we might have done a different technique. So fact patterns change your estate planning. So make sure you get your estate plan updated.
Right. That's great advice. Phil, so it kind of brings up, because as you think about the process, most people just think, oh, we're dividing up the assets, but there's usually more to it. So what are some of the biggest things that people miss when they go through the process and when they think about it that they need to be aware of?
Oh, I'm going to focus on the tax part of that for a second. Remember that we have a lot of different types of accounts, and the tax treatment of those accounts is different. There's a big difference. Like if you had $1 million of assets that you're splitting up, and let's say that $700,000 of it was in an IRA and $300,000 of it was in regular taxable assets, you're going to pay tax as you pull the money out of that IRA. So you can't just say one of them gets 500 of the IRA, and the other one gets 200 from the IRA and 300 from the taxable account, because there's a very different cost in accessing that money. So when I think about splitting up those assets, I want to think about the tax treatment of the different assets. I think that's really important. And you talk about the agreements and things like that to the family. As I have a client that they've gotten divorced, and he's just really not nice to her at all. And he's really trying to turn the kids against her. But the first time that I talked to her, the reason she reached out to me was that he had some accounts for the kids, and they were brokerage accounts, and there were capital gains. And he has a lot more income than she does. And he wanted her to report it, even though it's for the kids, and it got added on to his income instead. Now, that's something that could happen, but it needs to happen up front. You can't just go and throw this on people later on. So you want to think about that. That's why you want to talk to different people and work with different people besides just the attorney, the divorce attorney. You want to, as Megan said, you want to work with that estate planning person. You want to work with your tax person. You want to work with your financial planner to make sure that your best interests are considered, and that what happens in the end is fair and equitable to both parties. Yeah,
no, absolutely. So taxes, obviously one of the things. What else, Megan? What else do people typically miss when they're going through divorce? Or they don't think about immediately? Maybe they don't miss it, but things that you don't normally think about.
I would often tell you, one of the things I would say in working with a financial planner is it's really good as you're going through a divorce to run a long-term cash flow, to understand how all the other financial goals have changed, right? Everything has a ripple effect. And divorce, you often take 2 steps back to go forward, right? That's sort of part of the deal. So I think being able to rework your overall strategic plan is really, really important. And then, when people get divorced, they're always like, oh, I'm never going to get married again, never going to do anything again, right? And so I really encourage people to think about, like, I'm in the state of California. When we redo the estate plan, we make the trust a separate property trust, which is an important thing to think about, because it forces you to talk about the fact that maybe next time you get married, you don't commingle assets right away, right? You take your time, or you keep everything separate. And then over time, you start to merge everything. And that may be a better course of action. So, we learn the lessons from the mistakes that we've made in prior situations.
Yeah. So there's one other thing that comes up that people really think about, which is the impact on credit. So Phil, how is credit impacted by a divorce, and what should people be thinking about?
So remember that we each have separate credit. So when you're married, I always recommend to people, have a credit card in your name, have one in your spouse's name. So that way you both have your own independent credit records and credit histories, so that you can have your own rating. Because I know that I worked with a client, and she had her own credit, but she wasn't responsible for paying the bills. And it was a nasty split. And when she was moving out, she went to get an apartment, and she couldn't get one on her own. And the reason she couldn't is because her ex, or soon to be ex, stopped paying her credit cards. So she couldn't get any credit. When you rent, they check your credit history. So for her to be able to rent, fortunately, her parents were able to help her out. She had to reach out to her family and have her family give her money, because she had to put money down because they wouldn't let her rent the apartment because her credit had been damaged so badly. So just remember, you want to have a separate history, and make sure that you pay attention to it. There's plenty of free services out there that'll let you check your credit history. keep an eye on them, make sure that you know what's going on, because there's going to be times when you're on your own. Maybe you want a car, maybe you want to buy a house, or like I said, you're even renting a house or an apartment. You need to have your own credit history and your own credit record to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. So before we wrap it up, let's touch on like division, because I think, you know, different states have different ways of looking at it. So Megan, how do different states treat division of assets, community property versus, you know, how things work? Like what is there a typical, or how should people be thinking
Well,
about
here
it?
in California, and this is true in most states, right? Most assets become marital assets or community property assets when you get married, unless you specifically partition them out. And that's a really important thing, is if you don't want an asset to be a marital asset, you can take steps to partition. And one of the best examples of that is when you receive an inheritance. So an inheritance typically, you know, usually across the board, is not a marital asset unless you choose to commingle it. So if your parent dies, right, it is more well within your right to keep the asset separate in nature and not commingle it. And I will tell you, I was talking to someone recently who her father had passed, and she was married, but the marriage wasn't on great grounds. She kept the inheritance separate. And when they divorced, it did not become part of the divorce division. And so that was really, really important. So think about these things, because, you know, people are lax with their finances. They're not rigid with their finances. And the devil is in the details. So if you are going to have something that's going to be a marital asset, be explicit about it. And if you're going to have something that's going to be a separate property asset, be explicit about it.
Okay, great advice. So as we kind of wrap it up here, Phil, final thoughts from you.
I just want to echo what Megan just said about those inherited assets. I talk to clients about that all the time. If your parent passes and you get money, the inherited IRA, that's easy, right? Because that's only in your name. So you don't have to do a lot with that because it is yours. But if you have other assets and you want to make sure that you protect them just in case something happens, you could have the greatest relationship, but it still doesn't hurt to protect yourself. You can always pull those assets out and share them later, but keep them separate. It's just something to keep in mind.
Great. Where can people find more about you, Phil?
You know how stressful it can be when experience a big life transition? My job is to help empower women facing new beginnings with the financial knowledge and tools they need to make self-assured decisions. My firm is Apprise Wealth Management. You can find more out about me at apprisewealth.com. You can go to apprisewealth.com and download my free ebook, and also sign up for my weekly blog.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Phil. And Megan, final thoughts from you, and where can people find more about you?
I mean, two of the things I said previously, right? I mean, which is, first of all, if you can avoid getting divorced, do so, and be in a healthy relationship, because it does have an impact on your money. And at the same time, be generous if you are getting divorced, right? There's no use in fighting over some of this nonsense, because you will always see these people. So you can find me on Instagram at All the President's Money. Come join me on the journey to hear about all our different presidents and how they had money or didn't. And I'm Megan Gorman. Thanks for having me on, Kirk.
Thanks for coming on, Megan. And we'll have to have you as a guest on the show when your book comes out. I'm excited.
Okay, we got a good year until that happens, but yes, I would love to be.
It's
Then
be
we
a
can
build
talk
up.
about why Herbert Hoover's my favorite.
Be a 12-month build up.
Okay, perfect.
That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.